The Washington Post tonight reporting on conversations the president had with Vladimir Putin and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. The Post headline, Putin and Hungary's Orban helped sour Trump on Ukraine. According to the report, which cites current and former U.S. officials, the conversations reinforced President Trump's perception of corruption in Ukraine. The Post reports that neither Orban nor Putin specifically encouraged the president to see Ukraine as a source of dirt on Joe Biden, nor did they describe Kiev as complicit in that conspiracy theory that he latched onto about the 2016 election. However, the Post reports that their disparaging descriptions did reinforce the president's perceptions of Ukraine to the dismay of some of his advisors. Quoting now from the Washington Post, quote, over time, you just see a wearing down of defenses, a former White House official said, describing the struggle to contest the influence of Giuliani, Putin, and Orban. And just pause a minute to consider the implications. The leader of the one country that no president before this one has ever fully trusted was telling this president not to trust Ukraine, a country that Russia seeks to dominate. Joining us now is the Post's John Hudson, who shares a byline on the story. So, John, what exactly happened in these conversations between President Trump, Putin, and Orban? And I understand at least one of the conversations with Orban was face-to-face in the White House, and there wasn't anyone else present. Is that right?
That's right. U.S. officials described to the Post an alarming sort of evolution in President Trump's view of Zelensky and Ukrainian officials in general. Now, it started out a little bit positive. They had a congratulatory phone call, and U.S. officials were comfortable with the direction things were going, and then things turned sour. And so one conversation, for instance, he had with Vladimir Putin, Trump actually broached the subject of Zelensky and said, what do you think about him? And Putin said, according to a Western official familiar with the conversation, that this is someone who's a comedian, and this is somebody who is linked to Ukrainian corrupt oligarchs. He was speaking of Kolomoisky at this point. This was somebody who has a long time oppositional and sort of tiff with Putin over a long period of time. And so these conversations added to each other and sort of reinforced Trump's view already that Ukrainian officials are corrupt. Ukrainian officials did not want him to win the 2016 election. And that was a view that was very difficult for U.S. officials to combat and counteract, who saw Ukraine as a country that they wanted to ally with and strengthen with as it was fending off Russian-backed separatists in the east.
And according to your reporting, the efforts by Putin and Orban were actually anticipated by national security officials. I mean, how did it go from, folks in the Trump White House, the national security team, being concerned that Putin and Orban were going to be, whispering in the president's ear about this, to the point where that actually happened?
That's right. There was a very contentious decision over whether or not to invite Viktor Orban to Washington to have a meeting with President Trump. This is something that gives a lot of credibility to leaders, and a lot of U.S. officials saw the Hungarian prime minister as someone who was part of a sort of right-wing populist movement in Europe that is sort of antithetical to some Western values, not helpful towards the fight to support Ukraine against Russia. That's for sure. And they opposed that position. Of course, Trump was very much open to it, as he is to open with many world leaders that are not necessarily allies with the United States. And so ultimately, Trump's desire to meet with this person, who has been one of the most prominent backers of Trump in Europe, a continent that hasn't been necessarily warm to the president, he got that meeting. And in that meeting, Orban, who is a skeptic of Ukraine, some of that historical, some of that personal with the Ukrainian President Zelensky, again reinforced a view of Ukraine that is corrupt and not favorable to President Trump, thus further reinforcing these negative views the president has.
I also just want to be clear about this, because in the report you say that there's no indication that Vice President Biden came up in the president's conversations with either Putin or Orban. It would make sense for President Trump, who has now asked not only Ukraine to look into the Bidens, but also China, well known for their, fair investigations and treatment of any sort of suspect. It would make sense if you're asking China to investigate the Bidens, why not ask, Vladimir Putin? But there's no evidence that came up at all.
Right. He has outsourced that question pretty widely. There's no evidence that he outsourced that question and tried to get either the Hungarians or the Russians to get more information on Biden specifically. But he was poking around and he was asking, the views on Zelensky, and he certainly got some answers on that.
It's also amazing that his own people in the White House, or at least those who were there, Mattis and Kelly, were concerned about, what Putin might say to him, what the Hungarian prime minister might say to him. And nevertheless, they're gone, and he meets with the Hungarian prime minister one-on-one. And it's not until later, I understand, that Bolton and his counterpart enter the room.
Yeah, absolutely. And there have been a number of instances with which the president meets leaders, especially leaders who are not necessarily seen as friends of the United States. And there's not note takers in the room. There aren't a lot of the officials, such as the National Security Advisor or the Secretary of State, who will be in the room sort of overseeing this. And that's why a lot of this testimony, especially we're talking about senior State Department official George Kent, who testified last week, they sort of pointed to these meetings and noticed a trajectory and a change in President Trump's tone. But it's not like they have a lot of knowledge about what happened in those either, because the details of these meetings are not widely dispersed and disseminated within the White House and within the administration. And that's a pattern that has continued as the president becomes increasingly frustrated by leaks of the content of those discussions.
Yeah, John Hudson, stick around. I want to bring in CNN senior political analyst David Gergen, also CNN White House correspondent Caitlin Collins, and CNN chief legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. David, shouldn't Putin be the last person on the planet influencing how President Trump feels about Ukraine, given the fact that Putin has invaded Crimea?
Absolutely, and it's hard to think of a more wholesome trio than Giuliani, Putin, and Orban. It is like, what are we doing here? Listen, little context. It has been American foreign policy for some time now to support and strengthen Ukraine, to come to the aid of those leaders. That's why we were sending them money, because the Russians had invaded their country, were threatening to dominate the country. And so the whole point of Mattis and Kelly and Bolton was to reinforce the president and make sure he approached the Ukrainians in a sense of trying to help them. Instead, what the president listened to with Putin and Orban and Giuliani, and it soured his view on the Ukrainians. And that, instead of trying to go to support the Ukrainians, that's when the president then instead went to them for a favor, to dig up dirt in the political campaign. So I do think we see this from a foreign policy point of view as a very depressing, disappointing, and dangerous exercise of diplomacy by a president who simply isn't going to get reined in. I mean, that meeting with Orban, according to John, went for an hour with no note taker.
And Caitlin, I mean, the president, has suspicions about Zelensky and relationships with oligarchs. Zelensky did at least run on an anti-corruption platform and was won overwhelmingly, given the fact he had no career in politics, was a comedian. And the ambassador, who the president got rid of, was actually spearheading anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine. Last week, you had Nancy Pelosi, Caitlin, reportedly telling the president that all roads lead to Putin. Here we are with yet another road leading to or from Putin.
And this was a big question inside the White House when the president wanted to make that July call to Zelensky, because he had already made a congratulatory call earlier in the year. They had already spoken, gotten that out of the way. But people were surprised, we were told when we were reporting this out, by the president wanting to make that phone call, because before he had essentially dismissed Zelensky, believing he was just like his predecessor, he was going to be corrupt, that he wasn't ever going to be able to make any kind of reforms or changes that the president now says he wanted to see. But of course, also noting that the way the president has reacted to these two people who were very anti-corruption, and how the president has squared that with his insistence that this was all about corruption in Ukraine when he was pushing them about Joe Biden and about that unsubstantiated theory, really pulls that into view for you. And it kind of answers that question that a lot of White House officials were even asking us about, why it was that the president all of a sudden wanted to make that call after just 2 months before he had been pretty dismissive of the new Ukrainian leader from that get-go.
During this, early summer period, there is all this activity led by Giuliani, which is about, limiting our cooperation with the new president unless he comes across with the dirt on Biden. It's all going on at the same time. Now, whether that originated with the phone call from Putin in May or, other sources from Giuliani, who has his own connections in Ukraine, we certainly don't know that.
Yeah.
Business, but the thing about all the evidence is that it all fits together. I mean, it all fits together in an explanation that the president just didn't want anything to do with Ukraine unless they could come across with dirt. And every piece of evidence that has come forward in the depositions and certainly in the partial transcript that we've all seen many times, it all points in the same direction.